Good afternoon, at least those of you on the East Coast or Central Time. I guess even Mountain Time this time. Anyway, welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn entitled Magic 8 Splunk Props and Configurations. We appreciate your time today and believe you'll come away with additional tools that will assist you in your day-to-day work. Today's session will be delivered to you by Ellis Devaney, who is a Splunk architect and a member of our customer experience team that delivers Splunk expertise on demand to our customers and supports our Atlas product. The Atlas product helps you get the most out of Splunk. If you have any questions along the way, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them. Now, Ellis, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. All right, so we're going to kick it off talking about the Magic 8 in Splunk, and that is specifically relating to some props.conf configurations. So topic that, unless you do a lot of back-end Splunk administration, may be new for some of our participants here, and may just be some great pointers to people experienced in that area. So today, we are going to start off with a quick discussion of what props.conf is. We'll talk about our Magic 8 configurations individually, just so we have an understanding of what we're looking for as we go into what will be the bulk of the conversation today around working with data. Because this is really about the process of bringing data in the correct format. We're hoping to dive deep and show you some workflows and get pointers on your processes for data onboarding, and also making sure that we're able to validate all of those configurations that we set, and talk a bit about what the next steps are, what you can do with your data beyond this point. So to start talking about props.conf, this is really a necessary configuration file when you're working with data onboarding. When we say getting data in, we're often thinking about the basics of making sure we're sending data to our Splunk servers in the outputs.conf, that we're looking at the right files in the inputs.conf. Our next really important step is the props.conf. And the props.conf is where we configure all of our Splunk processing properties. So we'll talk about some of these categories today as a part of the Magic 8, but you can think generally about the props.conf whenever you're interested in line breaking or event breaking, when you're looking at timestamp extraction. Something that Splunk does automatically pretty well, but we have a lot of fantastic opportunities to work with configurations. In many of our Magic 8, you'll see we're talking about timestamps. Props is the place for field extractions. Even when you're working in the Splunk web UI, all of the settings that you save are going into a props.conf on the back end. When you work with structured data, XML, JSON, come across very frequently, you really get familiar with the props.conf because it takes some experience working with some of our Magic 8 and other advanced configurations to handle that data properly. And there are tons of additional options. So I'll pivot over, we'll pass some of our data we'll look at later. And I just want to point out the props.conf spec file is a fantastic resource when we're looking at the Magic 8 or just in general, when you're looking at the props.conf to see what options you have, what you can do with it. Our lines over on the right-hand side here, we can see lots of different categories and in this file, descriptions of each of the configurations in the props.conf. So spectacular resource. I've included it in our resources for the presentation today. So make sure you're aware of that as you start any sort of data onboarding process. So when we get into a props.conf file, it's important to think about each of our configurations, each of our stanzas, as giving us the ability to apply source type specific configurations. And so that's going to be really important as we're working with the Magic 8, that we are actually going to identify these each individually for a new data source. But as we think about these data sources, and we want flexibility and accuracy and configuration, we want to be able to define specific source types that apply to each of those data sources. So with today, we'll have 2 different source types that we create. We're going to be looking in the Magic 8 at these 3 categories. One is line and event breaking. These have some similarities, but some very important differences that I'll cover as we're talking about the individual configuration options. But this is ultimately what lets us split up events, define the start and end boundaries, and make sure that our routing to indexers is as effective as it can be. We will also look at timestamp parsing, seeing how we can get as accurate as possible when we're looking to extract timestamps from data, and make sure it's a performant process. The last category is going to be truncation. And this is really often an overlooked step because Splunk has some safe defaults around truncation of events. But we want to make sure that what we're getting in is all the data that we expect. And truncation really gives us a great opportunity to make sure our other configurations are correct, specifically our line and event breaking in the Magic 8, so that we know our data quality is good. And truncation gives us a great way to set off some alarms if we do have problems or a structure that may not be beneficial for us. So we're going to dive into each configuration of the Magic 8. And I do call out here, this is the first step in data onboarding. And I like to clarify a little bit that when you talk about data onboarding in Splunk, you still have the other components. You have to make sure you have that functional infrastructure you're forwarding is good. You know what files you're looking for, which would be the inputs and outputs. But the setting of props is really something you want to do on the front end as you are exploring your data and make sure you understand the structure. Oftentimes, you have add-ons that are pre-built that give you a lot of this done ahead of time. And if you're working with common technologies that have add-ons, it's definitely great to use those. I often encourage that you explore those pre-built configuration files. See of the Magic 8 what's actually set there, and you might find opportunities for improvements. So to get started here, our first 2 in the area of line breaking starts off with line breaker. This is a parameter that you're able to give a regular expression. And it's ultimately going to decide how events are broken up in Splunk. Splunk has a great default here for new line carriage return, looking for essentially white space between events when you have single line events. In a lot of system data, that's going to be a pretty good default. And you'll see that functions for even one of our data sources today. As we go through these, I'm going to hit on some recommendations that we'll pivot back to and make sure we're thinking about as we're working with our individual data sources. And one that I often see done around the line breaker is because with a lot of system logging, defaults are good. It's just excluded. For any of these configurations today, when you have the opportunity to identify an accurate configuration, it's great to set it anyway. So you can make sure if there are changes in your data that you knew the structure before, that you weren't just working from some background default, that you're very clear in calling out your props configurations. So line breaker is very straightforward, and we'll see shortly how to determine that for more interesting structured data. Should line merge is an option that might not be as intuitive as it sounds. In scenarios where we have individual events per line, it would make sense if we were to set this to false. There's not any sort of multi-line merging into single events that is necessary. And what we actually find as we're working with other structured data is that the line merging operations in Splunk are often going to be much more performant only when done as necessary. So most of the time we can actually set this to false, even in cases where we have multi-line data. That is a scenario where we won't be covering today in the demo, but there are some related advanced options. You can read all about it in the spec file for props of when you might need to consider a value of true for merging lines together into events. But for today, we're going to start with false. And so our line breaking, very straightforward, is I like to think of as related to event breaking, but event breaking itself is actually a process done with universal forwarders. You will see that specifying regular expressions for setting event boundaries conceptually is very similar to actually setting line breakers, splitting up data into multiple events. And general recommendations, as you might see through the default matching line breaker, is match your line breaker configuration. And event breaker enable is set to false by default, but setting true unless you have some very specific requirements for the forwarding of data to your indexers. It's a very deep topic and be great for a separate conversation. If you want to engage with my team, we're happy to dive into that deeper. For the purpose of today's conversation, I'd like to just think about event breaking as a capability to help with the routing of events to multiple indexers. And it's something that comes with universal forwarders as an option that we can very simply enable and is generally safe to use. Is something that if you're using universal forwarder versions past 6.x, so 7x versions of universal forwarders, this is something that you can try out until you have a very specific requirement for other configurations. So we've covered our first four here, line breaking and event breaking, and on to timestamp parsing. Time prefixes are a default empty string. So Splunk is really good at looking at events and by default will read a certain distance into an event to look for anything it can interpret as a timestamp. A very simple optimization we can do for individual data sources is specify some regex that tell Splunk where it actually needs to start. If you have a start of a timestamp at the beginning of an event, then you can still actually specify, please start at the beginning rather than just leaving configurations empty. So going back to that, set everything you can, be very clear with your Magic 8 configurations also applies here. And when we have other events, especially what we'll look at with structured data, where a timestamp may be in a certain portion of an event, we have the flexibility to tell Splunk exactly where that is. And of course, working with different technologies, we're going to come across quite a few different time formats for timestamps. So we have the time format option that will take a standard strip time format of a timestamp to be looking for in an event. So Splunk doesn't have to do as much guessing. It can just very specifically read a string and try to extract the timestamp based on what you specify. I'll jump back over to our references here and point out a document that I use very frequently in Splunk is date and time format variables. And this is, you can actually find this in various different resources because this strip time format as a standard is widely used. But you can see that we just have simple variables to specify. In this case, say we're comparing days as a number, or we have days as abbreviated names of the days. So we can create our combination that matches the timestamp in our event and give Splunk less work to do. So great area for optimization. So we actually have one more timestamp parsing configuration. And I mentioned this earlier, that Splunk is going to look a certain distance into events to actually identify a timestamp. And having set our time prefixes and our time formats, we're doing a lot of the work ahead of time to understand how long is that timestamp string generally going to be. And in many cases, we have the chance to shorten this default so that we're looking at a very specific area of the event to extract that timestamp. It is important as we're doing that, that we go through our processes, we have that educated guess of what a safe range is, and we make sure that we're not going to fall short of a timestamp in a particular event, and we'll see that that will immediately throw errors and you'll actually get incorrect timestamps for that. So an important note for the recommendation is use the information that you've gathered from your other configurations to make sure you're setting good values. And our final configuration of the Magic 8 is truncate. So truncate is the maximum event length in bytes. I often bring this up that it's specifically for events. In some cases, you have configuration of truncation based on line length. And then when you get into scenarios of, in Splunk, multi-line events where you're trying not to truncate data unnecessarily, if you go and take, say, an individual line and you set that value way too short, you'll get a partial event. And that's definitely not something we want to do. So as you are going through and identifying all of your other configuration parameters, you should be familiar with your data at that point. And we'll talk about a couple of steps you can take to get a good guess of what a safe truncation value is. I've heard advice through the years of always setting this value high, or in some cases, even seen this disabled in environments to make sure that Splunk gets all the data that it can. We're going to talk today about what I think is a safe and healthy ingest approach, which is making sure that you set your values close to what you need for your data, introducing opportunity for bad data or incorrectly formatted or broken up events. You would get junk data that you don't want, and in opportunities where you would otherwise truncate an event a bit too short. If you have a very large buffer and you're doing things like transforms and applying regex to your data, you can actually cause some other performance issues with Splunk. So our truncation, we'll see how to work with shortly. So I mentioned what we'll do today is take a look at a couple of different data sources, and we're going to be defining source types using our Magic 8. And it's important as you're going through this process that you actually know what you're working with. You need to source good samples that contain multiple events. And it's very important as you're sourcing your data to test with that you make sure you maintain the original format that those events are in, because it is very important that you preserve all of the precise white space and extra characters that Splunk's going to encounter in processing those original files. You want to test accurately as you're defining your props. Also, this generally goes without saying, but making sure when you're working with multiple data sources that you're separating them out into individual files so that we can test them separately, so that we can validate our configurations, and things will just generally make sense. We don't have to try to filter out errors, knowing that it works for one part of a file but not for another. So we'll see today that we have two individual files. One is the secure.log file, which is Linux OS authentication events. These are actually sourced from the Splunk tutorial data. And so that's freely available. You can download that at any time I'll have a link in the slides to be able to get that. And you can use that in your own development instances or test indexes in your Splunk environments to work with exactly this data. And then I have one custom file that is an XML export with some information about our past Lunch and Learn webinar sessions. So let's take a quick look at these files. So you can see in my editor here, this is our secure.log, and we have single line events. This may be very familiar data to many of you. This is often a log that you get very early on in your Splunk data onboarding process. So we can see that there are timestamps starting off the events, and just confirming we actually have end of line here and a new event starting on line 2. So comparing to our XML data here, scrolling up to the top, I have an XML header, and then this is an export with each individual session actually being what we're hoping to target for our individual events. So as we work through our Magic 8, you'll see some of the differences between the single line events and what we're going to do to handle our individual sessions here as unique events in this XML data structure. All right, so we're going to start off with a configuration checklist. And this is how I approach this problem every time. It's just making sure I have my list, and I typically approach the props configuration in this order because it just makes sense for the workflow that I'll show you today. And you're really building up awareness of your data as you're defining these different parameters. I also, jumping back to my editor, will encourage, as you know your configuration parameters for the Magic 8, you can actually set up a props.conf before you even have the values here. So you're seeing a bit of a spoiler on some of our configurations we'll identify. But you can start out with a stanza each for your data sources that you're testing with. And then you'll be able to add in your parameters following along with that recommendation that even if it's a default, I'm going to set it here, make sure that this is contained in a file that I can apply to any Splunk environment that this might be applicable to, especially when you're doing local development, need to incorporate this into production configuration. You have your props.conf already structured. It's much easier to do that. So we'll be going through our checklist here, starting with line breaker. So for our first line breaker, we're going to be jumping into a regex tool. I use regex 101, use various sites over the years, and use whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you know. Anything that's going to let you validate your regex and matching to generally defaults. You'll see we're PCRE 2. Generally defaults are going to match up with the regex in Splunk that we'll be using to actually perform these operations. So just a consideration there. If you have an obscure flavor of regex that you're used to testing with, make sure that you jump to PCRE 2. But we do have here, as we'd expect, our single line events. And I'm going to actually copy in our default, and we can see what Splunk would do regardless. So this is going to work. We have individual events per line, and our default is looking for carriage return new line, at least one, and then another if necessary, but we are able to separate our events this way and very simply have our first line breaker for the secure logs. Now, if we are jumping to our XML and applying our default here, then we'll see that this is going to break each individual line up obviously this does not work, wanting to group our sessions together as individual events. So I'm going to copy in what some of you might be familiar with as one of the topics you learn in Splunk Data Admin Labs, and that is working with getting XML events to come in the groups that you want. And that's very simply making sure that after your default, you have optional white space, which is going to handle any position of the tag that you have. So in the blue text here, preceding session, and then acknowledging the session. This is going to be our start of each individual event. So in your configurations for line breaker, you'll see in the default that we actually have the parentheses, a capture group, and a capture group is necessary in a line breaker configuration. It's actually very flexible in how you can apply it, and you do have the opportunity to exclude data based on that capture group. So here we're just going to exclude our new line and make sure that we're starting fresh here on the line with session, and we'll jump all the way down to our closing tag for session for each individual event. With XML and JSON as well, I'm often thinking about, okay, we have handled the common pattern across the file, but what happens down at the very end where we're seeing that we're basing this off of an opening tag, but we do have our closing export tag. This is something that I try to separate out as early as I can, and something that you can definitely consider in your Magic 8. So I'm expanding my regex here, and this is very simply adding on to what we had earlier. This is an OR operator. So we're looking for what worked for the bulk of our events, or if we have a very similar pattern with the export closing tag. So this will filter out export into its own event or split on the end of that last session. This does bring up an opportunity for topics around transforms and cleaning data a little bit more before you ingest into Splunk, where you have the opportunity to regex match and route data or drop data that you may not want. The export closing tag and the headers of XML are great examples of that. It is outside the scope of today's discussion. So for today, I'm going to leave the export tag and leave that as possibly a follow-on exercise where you may filter out the extra events there that we don't want. But our primary concern with the Magic 8 is that we have the events with the open and close session tags. So we have our line breakers identified. And number 2 is should line merge. So it is very clear for our single line events that should line merge of false is going to be fine, and we're going to take that option. It is a question with the XML, if line merging, we want multiple lines in an event set as true, logically might make sense for XML, but defining a very clear line breaker lets us set line merge to false. And that reduces some overhead operation of Splunk in processing. And because we have our structured events that are consistently start and end of our session tags, we don't need any advanced operations to call out a condition where there does need to be some specific line merging. That can really become a more advanced topic quickly. I won't cover in detail today an example, but if you'd like to see what some of those configurations or what the data looks like in that scenario, I recommend looking into some of the internal Java logging of the DB Connect app. And you'll see a lot of interesting multi-line messages of that application running. So our event breaker and enabling the event breaker are our next configurations. And very simply, we're going to match our line breaker. So we already have our value. And in this case, our universal forwarders are going to match what's understood by the indexers as the point to break the individual lines into events. And we're sending those chunks in just the same format to indexers separately. So we'll make sure that that feature is enabled. And I know I'm running the latest version of universal forwarders, so I'm safe to set that value of true. Always consider the versions of universal forwarders that you're running on to make sure that those versions are able to support the event breaker enable. This is also a time when I try to note the Magic 8 used to be the Magic 6. We actually added the event breaker and event breaker enable when those features were introduced. And so you might hear Magic 8, Great 8 in around these topics of the indexer routing for the universal forwarders. Again, it's kind of a deeper topic, but anytime you come across documentation talking about those features, just know that this is the same topic, and working with these rules with these simple defaults is a great way to get started, and then modify as you hit edge cases. So we're moving into the second half of our Magic 8 configurations here. And the way that I order how I do timestamp parsing makes it easy to jump right back into our regex tool because we can see here in our XML, we want to look for our timestamps, which are very consistently just after our presentation date tag. So if I enter my presentation date as my regex to identify the prefix of my timestamp, then we have identified everything that's available to us in the logs here. So very simple. You already have your data here in your regex tester, and that is our value for presentation date. This is also another reminder for the recommendations. By default, we're going to start at the beginning of an event. So is it safe to leave the empty value? Absolutely, it is. I like to set the configs everywhere I can. And you do have the option when you're starting at the beginning of an event to use the caret character and regex start of line. And you can see that we're actually highlighting right there at the start of the line to start off our timestamp. So very small addition there, but a good check for your accuracy. Make sure you understand where it is. Don't just guess that the default is going to work for you. So we have done all of our regex testing, and we have number 5, our time prefix. Now we're getting to time format. And this is something that I generally recommend if you're very familiar with time format variables. I've had success in the past of just dropping in the pattern that's easy to identify. If you work with this frequently, you pick up on the common symbols. And I still like to test using the tools that I have available. And I often find that it is easiest to actually use Splunk. So Splunk provides a strip time function where we can take in an event and a value, apply the time format variables, and extract a timestamp from it. And on top of that, we have the convenient use of the make results command that lets us feed data into a Splunk search. It's not requiring us to ingest this data first to actually work with the timestamps. What I've done here is provide with the make results CSV format. I have 2 columns here, one for each of my source types. And I also have in my first column a matching example of a timestamp. And then again, an example of the timestamp for my second source type. You can see just running this search gives us a quick table. And this is the string that Splunk is going to be parsing to try to extract time. So I'm going to drop in a couple lines of SPL here, and we'll talk through the use of the strip time function, as well as the time format variables associated here. So strip time is an eval function specifically for working with timestamps. It's the inverse of strip time in that you're working with a string, providing a format, and producing a valid timestamp value. Strip time, you'll often see you're working with Splunk's extracted timestamp value, and you're reprinting time in a format that's appropriate for your use case. Strip time lets us match up what we're seeing here in our secure log, which is abbreviation of day, an abbreviation of month, day, year as a 4-number year, and then hour, minute, second. And so we actually have, in referencing our documentation here for the date variables, we can see that we see our date, we see our abbreviation for month. As you work with this documentation more and more, you get comfortable with where the different sections are, and always reference the right side over here to jump around where it's appropriate. We can see just in our 2 events here that we have some common values, but sometimes you may have to pull some more obscure time format variables. So we have a line each where we're providing our time format based on what we're reading of the example timestamp. And then we have a convert function here. So without the convert function, running this actually gives us a Unix time in the field that we've created, just to validate that in human readable format, this timestamp matches up to the time in the log. We're doing a quick convert ctime. And this is very simply the format for extracting for each of our individual events. So this is what you would note in your props.conf. And now that we have our time format and we've set our time prefix, we know that we're always going to be starting processing right at the beginning of the timestamp. And we have this opportunity in using Splunk here and writing our strings into the search that you can get some more information on how many characters you actually need to read ahead for the time format. And so this is specifically pertaining to our look ahead for the timestamp. And so we see that in this scenario, there are 24 characters for our secure log for this timestamp we have here. Timestamp look ahead is one thing where I generally recommend to add a bit of buffer. And it's important in scenarios where you have what will be variable length portions of the timestamp. When you say maybe a whole month or a whole name of day, where that's going to fluctuate some. Say you picked a short example and you just use that value, you're going to have incorrect timestamps on the longer values in your events. So in our example here, we have 24. I do know that this is going to be a consistent time format in terms of length, but in the case that maybe there's a change and we're using that full day name, it's not going to hurt to bump it up just a bit. So I'm saving in my configuration a value of 30 for our secure timestamp look ahead. And then for our XML data, you may remember that we had very, very simple day or month, day, year. And this is always going to be a consistent length. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to have max timestamp look ahead equivalent to the number of characters because I know it's consistent, and we can demonstrate if you have the precise value, it will still function for your props.conf. So our values for 5, 6, and 7 are complete. And then truncate is an interesting parameter to work with in terms of identifying length of individual events. because there are many ways to tackle this programmatically. There are many ways to tackle this with online tools. Just with my editor here, I can highlight a line and see that I have 117 characters here. I have 104 characters. If I were to go to a longer line, I have 124 characters. Truncation is recommended often to have maybe the longest event that you see in your samples, and then add some to that value. I believe in my own Splunk training, it is longest value seen plus 256. In my experience working with different types of data, I often find that you're working with relatively small numbers, and it's going to be fairly safe and far less than the 10,000 by default to take the value that you have of a long event and then assume the worst, that you're going to have an event that comes in with a very long event message, and it is longer than you would expect based on that assumption. In this case, plus 256 would be safe, but if we were to jump to, say, 300, we're still in the ballpark. It gives us quite a bit of buffer based on what we're observing in the events here. In the case of our XML, we still need to think about truncation being for the full event. So we have here a highlighted event that has 269 characters. We have varying length of titles. So in this case, for a rather long title, we're seeing 287 for our event length. If we were to bump this up to, say, 600, it's a little bit above that formula of our plus 256, but it's still going to be in the ballpark, much less than 10,000, and giving us some safety if we were to have a longer event. And in scenarios where you have custom data sets like this, a lot of times you'll see that if these are being generated manually, so think CSV files, or in this case, we have some change to our XML export as to include links for all of our past Lunch and Learn presentations. I do need to reevaluate because we have a new consistent format of data. We need to make sure that all we've done for our line breaker still makes sense. Generally, that'll work fine with our open and close tags of XML, but it does greatly affect our event length. So any sort of changes you have to data, you want to be constantly evaluating and make sure you don't have any sort of errors. So we're gathering all of our information here in our props.conf, and we've walked through each of these configurations. I'm going to jump back here and talk about validation of ingest, and then we'll go through the process of applying these configurations and viewing how those apply to the individual source types in Splunk. And so when I'm thinking of testing and creating configurations, I always want to do that in the safest environment possible. Where I have the chance to work in a local Splunk instance, I do so. I'm working today out of a Docker instance. I do a lot of local testing in Docker instances for Splunk. In many environments, we'll encounter a dedicated development instance that is specifically for this scenario, that you're working to create your configurations before you promote them to production, and you don't introduce junk data. In some scenarios where you work entirely out of a production Splunk instance, you still have the opportunity to create testing indexes. And it's always highly recommended in the data onboarding process that you create a testing index. You have a short retention volume. You're not hanging on to junk data or incorrectly formatted data for extended periods of time. And we have a place where we can work through the process. We ingest the data, and we can look at our raw event text. We can search that index, see what's usable, see what's missing. We can check our timestamps to make sure that everything based on the raw text in samples that we look at matches the value that Splunk has pulled out. And then once we've ingested data, we have some great opportunities to actually check where Splunk has encountered errors. And I'll actually show through the data ingest process of uploading a file in the Splunk UI that you'll get some warnings ahead of time for working with your sample files. So you don't even necessarily have to ingest the data to make sure that your configurations apply correctly. So I'm going to jump over to my Splunk instance here, and we'll start in add data. And I'm just pulling up on the side my files. In Splunk Enterprise, you have under settings an option to add data, one of our big blocks on the left side. And there's an upload option in the bottom left. I'm going to start with my secure.log, and I'm uploading that file. And this is where, if you're working through setting your configurations, say you really get the hang of working with a lot of the Magic 8, and you're able to say, just recognize the timestamp format, and you want to apply that on the fly and validate, you have the option here on the left to go through and apply advanced props settings. And you can save that to your local development instance or the Splunk instance, say in prod. You can save a specific new source type with the settings you've applied here. You'll see a lot of defaults actually pop up in the view here. And we want to add anything from our Magic 8 that we didn't have previously. Now, for the sake of time, I've done this for our Lunch and Learn, our LNL source types. And I'm going to open this up for the secure logs. So you can actually see when we use the default that Splunk is not seeing our day on the timestamp. This is a perfectly valid timestamp to just start by month, day, year, and have the time. But just understanding our data, and for the sake of accuracy, we know that we've specified the day in our timestamp. We've chosen to work from the beginning of each line for our configuration. And you can see that we're updating from the defaults to get a more accurate match. So here in my configurations, again, date time config is an empty value as default. Category and description are some other fields that you enter as you save a custom source type through the UI in Splunk. But we can see our Magic 8, and we can see our event breaker applying correctly. Our line breaker is matching. We have our truncation value of 300, which works for our data. This is a great place to check and see if your values for truncation are correct, and if you would run into any issues. So I've shortened my value here to 300. You can see that I'm immediately getting errors for all of my events here, where I'm less than the number of characters present in the line. And so, again, just a great method to check ahead of time before you get there in ingesting your data to make sure it's as accurate as possible. Not have to sift through errors, not have to re-ingest the data for the purpose of testing. So we have all of our configurations. Timestamp is accurate. We're not truncating. Our events are broken up. So we're hitting all of our major categories there. We have in our example, I'll ingest into a test index in a local Splunk environment. Obviously, use whatever flexibility you have creating your test indexes. Please do go through whatever established procedures you have in your environment to create a new index. Work with your Splunk admins to make sure test indexes are present. If you follow this through the UI in a distributed environment, you very well might just create an index that doesn't actually exist where your data is going. So make sure that index is there. And then we have our LNL secure source type data uploaded. You can, with multiple examples, go right back to add more data. And I'll copy in my XML. We'll set our source type. Before we do, very important to see, that defaults for our line breaker are not working with our XML. We found that very quickly in regex 101. And we expect to separate our sessions out into individual events if we go and apply our props.conf. We are able to see that we've extracted events, and we are consistently getting our open and close session tags as the start and end of each individual event. I will call out again, we have our XML header, we have this open export tag. Down at the bottom, we do have our close export tag. We still have some errors that we're not matching. We specified a time prefix, a look ahead, a format. These aren't identified in these extra events. And beyond the scope of this discussion, this would be an opportunity to use transforms with your props and clean these up before you index your data. So we, again, have our separation into individual events. We can see that our truncation limit of 600 is perfectly viable for this length of event that we have here. And our timestamps are actually going to be starting, because we just have a day specified, we're going to be starting at midnight on that day. And that is how timestamp extraction will work for the less specific time formats. You'll actually find that in working with time format variables in the Splunk UI or in any sort of search use case. You actually have to specify down to a day. You try to specify just a month and a year, you might see that your strip time or strip time values aren't working. And you don't get very verbose errors there. So just a tip in working with those time formats and the reason why we're seeing our midnight value here for these dates. So we're able to ingest into our test index, and our data is available. So I'm going to jump over and search my test index for all time. I know it's a relatively small amount of data, and I can actually see my events that didn't have timestamps extracted. And it's applied this timestamp here for my latest event, and I actually have a matching timestamp for the latest surrounding event for my closing export tag. Again, this would be a process I would want to go through to clean these up, not have these with our data, but we can see across time here, we're seeing a lot of events in the last week from our tutorial data, and then we have a lunch and learn session for every month for the past year. So we can see those scattered throughout. So everything looks like it is broken up correctly. And this is something that we were able to validate in the UI because we've uploaded files. If you're working with, say, a monitor in an inputs.conf, or you're doing one-shot data ingestion on the CLI in Splunk, then this search view is where you typically be doing your quick validation for your line breaking, your timestamp extraction, and your truncation. A little bit harder to visualize the truncation, but we have a great tool in the Splunk monitoring console. This is actually in both the enterprise monitoring console and the cloud monitoring console under the indexing, inputs, and data quality view. You have these various categories of parsing issues that we've encountered. And so for demonstration prior to this session, I ingested our secure logs with too short of a truncation value. And we're seeing it's classified under the line breaking category because of the indexing processor that handles that operation in Splunk. But we can actually jump in and see more details of what's going on here. And so that's true for any of the areas in this table. For the sake of our Magic 8, our line breaking and our timestamp parsing are of most interest. And we do have a good quick breakdown by source type. You can see that we have a couple of issues with timestamp parsing for our XML data. And I mentioned as we opened up our test index events and just search generally, our XML tags that had the invalid matches for our configured timestamp parsing values. And so we're actually seeing our 2 events for our header and our closing tag. As you're going through these events, the monitoring console does drop you into a great place to explore further for any particular source types. It is, in my opinion, preferred to not try to deconstruct these monitoring console searches to make them more flexible for, say, a particular exploratory use case. It is quite easy to jump in and say, across multiple source types that have common patterns. So both today started with L and L for lunch and learn. We just have our one data source type with the line breaking issues. Getting familiar with your internal logging components in Splunk, you might also just have a back pocket search to go looking for issues when you know you might encounter this type of error. And in this case, you can more directly search your line breaking processor component and any sort of data source types that you might be expecting to work with. And in this case, we're returning exactly the same events. Just another quick shortcut. If you know exactly what you're looking for, great saved search to be able to further explore truncation issues in the environment. So with that, we have confirmed our line breaking, our separation into events. We've looked through our timestamps. We made sure that we don't have any issues there, or no more than we would expect based on our configurations. And we have identified a previous issue that we've now corrected with our truncation. So I've mentioned this multiple times as we've gone through the presentation here, that the Magic 8 are really a starting point. You have your basics down, you know where your data is, you know that you're able to send data to Splunk. We want to define these Magic 8 for any new source type that we have. But then what steps do we take afterwards? We haven't gone into great detail of how to further use the data. It's present in Splunk. What can I do with it now? We do want to make sure that there aren't extra events or any sort of formatting ahead of time that we might need to do for events, data masking as well, transforms on top of props. Another great topic, something that my team would be happy to discuss, is a great step alongside your Magic 8. Field extractions are the follow-up, making sure that you can use everything in your events. You can search on it more easily and really enable users to develop content logically, not have to, in the context of a search, go and say use regex to pull out fields for use in the dashboard. We want to make that as easy as possible. We want to make sure that if we were working with our XML data here, that I could quickly make a chart and present our lunch and learns over time using our timestamp values. Or I could get statistics on how many recordings are available currently. So field extractions are really the next big step in data usability. And beyond field extractions, data normalization, which we've discussed in previous lunch and learn sessions, is the step to bring data in line with data models and make sure that you can benefit from either the performance enhancements or the ability to correlate data across multiple technologies or common data sources for more general use cases, often seen in Splunk premium products like enterprise security, or even great free tools such as the InfoSec app, Compliance Essentials app, great Splunk built utilities focused on the use of the common information model for the data that you have available. So that does conclude our coverage of the Magic 8, how to actually work with data to get all of your configuration values, and how to go through and quickly validate that what you've set is working for the data that you want to be getting into Splunk. I've linked the tutorial data so you can go through and recreate any of this with a secure logging in your own environment. I have also linked the regular expressions basics in Splunk Lunch and Learn previously done by our team. Because there's a lot of regex in the Magic 8, it was a great resource. And in general, working in Splunk, it's great to have regex knowledge. I also mentioned data normalization, which is a core piece of our working with data models Lunch and Learn. And of course, any questions that you have, you can go to our Atlas Customer Experience Support Portal. And as a current customer, you all are familiar with how to engage with us there. But you are able to sign up and get information about our Atlas platform and expertise on demand service as well. I do also want to encourage, if you've enjoyed this session or any of the topics mentioned here, definitely join us next month. So we talked here about really getting started with data onboarding, really crucial process of making sure that your events are structured correctly. Related to this, processing your events and making sure they're going to the location that you want. Ingest actions are a really important part, a great feature of Splunk 9, and a method for making sure you're routing data where you want it to go. We're expanding on our previous session to discuss remote destinations with S3 storage, and that is going to be covered by our team member, Brett Woodruff. So with that, I will wrap it up and pass it back to Steve.
Thanks, Ellis. Thanks for the information you presented today. It was very thorough, and I hope you who've been listening have been able to learn a little bit more, expand your knowledge of Splunk. Go ahead and pass any of your questions that you have. If you've been holding back, go ahead and post them. In the meantime, there have been a couple of questions, Ellis. One of them is public. It says, does the use of transactions affect the value of truncate? Example, ignores for a transaction.
I'm catching up on the chat, and I am not sure if the Q&A panel has also covered the answer to that. I'm not familiar with the reference to ignoring values for truncate, so I'd want to double back on that and make sure I get an accurate response. So please do, if you want to privately message contact info, happy to discuss further there.
Okay, great. I am going to, in the chat, post also links for those of you who are on, who can go ahead and click in there and grab that link for the next Lunch and Learn that Ellis was talking about. Also, last month's Lunch and Learn was about the cloud monitoring console. So both of those links are out there and should work. If you go to the part of the URL, big marker /Kinney-group, just put that in there. You'll see the entire list of webinars that we have done. You can also go to our website, kinneygroup.com, and under resources, Splunk webinars. Takes you to the same place. So we will be following up with an email, and we'll answer, Stephen, your question, at least to the best of our ability. If there is no more questions.
I'm seeing a question that was answered in chat, I believe, as I was talking, but really important point to say out loud, wondering about the impacts to performance in introducing these configurations for production environment. As I've discussed, our process to identify each of the configurations, these are, unless otherwise specified, and I recommend as the recording is available, check back on individual configurations, especially around the event breaker. Unless there are specific conditions that require a particular setting for a parameter, most of these we've set thinking of optimizing performance and you generally see performance improvements in your environment. So yes, ideally you're designing these to optimize your production environment. And there was a note on that as far as different platforms. Generally speaking, for Splunk production deployment locations, you would see those performance improvements.
Thanks, Alice. If there's nothing else, hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month. Thanks. Have a great day.